Welcome back to the boss mode walkthrough series. This is the start of chapter 7, which is going to be Elite Vanguard. We're going to first run normal mode with our typical undead team. Now, looking over the enemies here, it's always important to review these enemies just to see what you're up against. Based on what we're looking at here, we have a mixed bag of red and green. What that means for us is that it's possible that Hansuke might take a little bit of damage from the red. The green shouldn't pose too much of a problem, but we don't see any fast enemies here, which is always good for us. That does technically open up the door for a speed team in the long run. If you take a look at the heroes that are involved there, if you're familiar with which ones are which, you should be able to identify what sort of moves are going to happen. What sort of skills they're going to be using, and we'll get into that as soon as we get queued up here. So we're just using our standard undead team here. If you have a good, strong undead team, you'll probably be able to auto run most of this dungeon if you need to. We'll actually go through room by room and just micromanage it just so you can see what some of the guys do. So looking over the enemies here, we have the green knights, which are basically going to serve as the taunters. The caster or healer is going to be doing some AoE damage as well as probably some heals as well. And then the red Balogs are going to be primary damage. I don't think they do much in the way of silencing like the regular Balog does, but he can generally be dispatched first. If you can get around the taunts, I would suggest to get rid of the green Balogs first because they will hit the hardest. They are the equivalent of fully ascended Balogs. You can tell by the basically the portrait that they're using. He's got the multi-spiked club, which is the equivalent of the second ascension on Balog. Looking at the individual buffs on the enemies, there's nothing too threatening that you need to worry about. Like I said, you do want to watch out for the Balogs because they will buff themselves. Fortunately, nobody in this dungeon is immune to dark attacks, so if you need to whip out a AoE from Brahm, that is going to be very helpful. And if you just need to use some skills from Zom as well, you're not going to be limited to just his Taste for Brains or his From the Grave move. With this room being that there's a ton of Balogs in here, normally I would suggest if you see a room like this and don't have a highly leveled up undead team, it's probably going to be better if you try to kill them quickly. Because they're not slow enemies, they're going to get hits in on all of your guys. So having vigilance on Hansuke is going to be almost a must here because he will soak a lot of these single hits. Being that you have to wait for every one of those guys to go before Zom and Brahm can go, you do run the risk of maybe losing somebody if your heroes aren't leveled up that high, or you don't have a lot of powerful runes on you. So be cautious about that in terms of how you approach these rooms. My general philosophy for an underdeveloped undead team, make sure you keep vigilance up on Hansuke so that he can soak up as many of those death blows as possible. Even though it's going to be a lot of red against green, he should parry a lot of those attacks. And hopefully, if he does jump in front of a death blow, you at least have him revived 2 turns later from his honorable death. Aside from that, there's not really anything tricky that goes through with the individual dungeons themselves or the rooms. The Abigails can hit pretty hard, but ultimately the only people that they would really damage are going to be Hansuke, and he's already got such high defense as it is. You can see there Yorick dispatched one pretty easily without too much trouble. And honestly, Brahm and Zom are not going to be affected by them too much either. They just simply can't do the amount of damage to those guys as they would if you brought, say, a standard green team in here that doesn't have as high a defense. So because Hansuke is armored, that attack there from her is not going to do very much. So as long as Yorick is doing his job as always, he's going to heal what little damage he actually does take, and then you can kind of cruise through here. Just like I said, if you do have a decent undead team and you prefer this over the speed run, you can certainly auto run the vast majority of this. If your Yorick is maxed out on his epic, there's very little that's going to cause you problem unless you get one of those rooms with all of the Balogs in it. at which point they're just going to get a couple of pot shots in you before you can dispatch them. So in this case here, I chose to do the armor attack from Yorick just so that I could guarantee that that red one was going to be killed. I know that when we get to the boss room, a lot of times bosses are immune to debuffs, and usually Yorick's first move is always going to be his marked for death anyways, so it was just a good use of a skill here. So that's another thing that you want to consider is when you're using your skills, think about when is a good time to actually use skills, just so that you're guaranteeing you kill guys, guarantee you get that 3-star, and just plain overall smart. So like in this case here, I got my vigilance back up on Hansuke. That's always going to be good going into a boss room because that will allow him to attack on the first turn. When you have an epic weapon on Hansuke, there's always the possibility that he's going to unleash an epic attack and buff the team defense. If you don't have to use vigilance on the first turn, that's always a benefit for you. And plus that will also allow you to possibly use his healing attack too if there is a fast boss. Now, both of these bosses, when you look at their buffs, there's basically the typical buffs that everybody has where they're immune to this or immune to that, like silence, for example, and they can't be dazed. But the big thing with these bosses here is they both have what is called boss poison. Boss poison is not something that you want to stick around. So you do want to dispatch these guys as quick as possible, even though they're not immune to dark attacks, which usually anytime there's a boss that's not immune to dark attacks, you can sort of slow play it because Braum and Zom can use pretty much any of their skills. But the one guy is immune to critical attacks, so you want to make sure that you're dishing out heavy damage to him. But use your marked for death since they're not immune to that. Get rid of one of them or both of them as quickly as possible because you do not want boss poison lingering around. If you've seen any of the boss status effects before, they typically mean business. If you've seen boss frostbite, it does 45% damage instead of the typical 20. So it's pretty rough stuff. So in this case here, mark him for death. Get rid of this guy first because he is going to taunt. It saves you from trying to do damage on one and then have to switch your focus target. But that also means that because he taunts and because you're marking him, you should be able to clear him out pretty easily with either of Zom or Braum's skills. I chose to not do any of my hardcore skills to start with because I know of this other attack that's going to be coming and I want to be able to get a good heal. Anytime you're using marked for death, that's how you want to use your heal with Braum because he's going to return damage based on what he does. Now, if that triple attack would have hit Zom all 3 times, it may very well have killed him. But now the clock is sort of ticking because we have boss poison on him. So I use my mark for death heal here with Braum to keep the team up. And you can see it still took a good tick off of his life, I would say. Probably about 1/5 of his life. So that's assuming that he has pretty high health as well. If your Zom isn't a high health Zom, you need to be prepared for that boss poison doing a pretty bad tick. And like I said, because they're not immune to dark, it really opens up your arsenal to use whatever skills you want to. So I'm able to actually dispatch both of these guys pretty quick. If you're going to have a hard time killing them in the first couple of turns, you do want to whip out your friend heroes and sort of take care of them a little bit faster than what we normally would. With that said, that's going to end this video. We're going to move on to the next one, and we're going to do a speed run of the same dungeon. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or you can let me know personally.